So today I'm going to talk about the core of environmental economics. I'm going to talk about externalities, and I'm going to talk about public goods. Before I do so, I'm going to run down very quickly micro, or part of micro, just as a refresher. But I'm going to spend most of the time talking about market failures, as well as towards the end a little bit about public policy. This is lecture 2. This is the sequence that I announced and haven't deviated from. Okay, let's start with static efficiency. So, and as I said, I'm just going to repeat things that you should know from last year and the year before. But in case you forgot, a situation, let's call it A, is Pareto superior to a situation B if in situation A, nobody is worse off and at least one person is better off. Right? That is Pareto superiority. And this actually, we call it Pareto superiority, but it actually goes back to Aristotle, who argued that if you have a whoever is doing that, can you please stop? It's very annoying. Somebody is just banging something. It's we have a leak. I can tell that to stop, but it doesn't listen, right? Fuck's sake. A voluntary bargain between two people has to be mutually advantageous, because if it were not advantageous to either party, they would not voluntarily engage in that bargain, right? Aristotle noted that. And therefore any trade that is voluntary is Pareto improving. Any exchange where two or more parties engage freely has to be mutually advantageous for them, and therefore, by definition, has to be Pareto improving. Pareto optimality is that point where there is no further Pareto improvements possible, where we've exhausted all exchanges that are mutually advantageous. Now, if a market is perfect, it is in a Pareto optimum, or as we call it in the ugliest of jargon, it is efficient. Economists are fond of the word efficiency. Outside of the discipline of economics, efficiency has a completely different meaning. So I prefer to use the word Pareto optimality, and definitely if you're talking to non-economists, I would suggest that you use the word Pareto optimality rather than efficient, because it just causes confusion. And the reason that a perfect market is efficient is very simple. Every trade in that market is advantageous, so it's a Pareto improvement. And at a certain point the market stops trading, and that means that there's no further deals possible that would make at least one person better off without making anybody worse off. Right? So a market would tend towards Pareto optimality. Of course, you need to, and I'll get back to that later, you need to impose all sorts of constraints or conditions on that market for this to work, right? The argument that a market leads to Pareto superior situations, that is very easily made, but in order to get it to Pareto optimality, you actually need to assume a whole lot of things about this market. And what I just said is just the first welfare theorem, right? That I also talked about last week. Now, let's make this a little bit more precise. I'm going to look at a very simple exchange economy. We have two persons, A and B. We have two goods, X and Y, and those two goods can be made with two inputs, L and K. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, someone who's on Zoom just left me to that earlier here.
Can you hear me now? And no, this is the recording that I listen to. I'm not on mute. Now I am on mute. Okay, we're going to switch to this mic. Maybe that's better. I don't know. It seems to be going greener now than it did. So I think there's two systems fighting for microphone attention. That's what's going on. Where was I? And why do I have two things open? I also need to share screen, right? Let's do that as well. Okay. Will I make it on time is now the question. Come on. Here it shows the right thing, but here it doesn't. Okay. This thing doesn't work anymore, but this thing does now. But of course, the people on Zoom are looking at this one and not at that one. Sorry, you guys also can't see what I'm doing because you're looking at a different screen than I am. How is this even technically possible? I'm doing things that I'm not quite sure that I was capable of doing. So we have a very simple exchange economy. Two people, two goods, two inputs. Utility is derived from consumption. And you make these things through production functions. Also means that I cannot point at the screen, right? Because my screen pointer doesn't work for you guys. So output is a function of the two inputs. Output x and output y are a function of the two inputs k, and then kx is the amount of capital you devote to the making of x, and lx is the amount of labor you devote to the making of x, right? And then subscripts denote first partial derivatives. So u sub x is the first partial derivative of u to x, right? And of course this holds for consumer A. Superscripts denote the person or the company we're talking about. Okay, so now my mouse moves this screen, but not that screen. Jesus. And can I now share screen again with these guys? Yes, we're now moving in parallel. So it depends on the order in which I open applications. So, efficiency in consumption. So there's three parts to Pareto optimality, or to efficiency: efficiency in consumption, efficiency in production, and allocative efficiency. Efficiency in consumption means that the marginal rate of substitution, the ratio of utilities, marginal utilities of consumer A, if they consume good X or goods Y, so that's U sub X over U sub Y for consumer A, should equal the same ratio for consumer B. That is the first order condition for efficiency in consumption. And this is easily seen if this were not true. Say the ratio is 5 to 1 on the left hand side and 1 to 5 on the right hand side. Then what consumer A can do is give up 1 unit of Y, the thing that consumer A appreciates least. That of course leads to a loss of utility of -1, but give that Y to consumer B and get an X in return, then that would be a gain of 5 for consumer A. That's a net gain of 4. And similarly, because the ratio is the exact opposite for consumer B, consumer B would lose 1 and gain 5, so a net gain of 4, right? So this condition has to be met for efficiency in consumption. The marginal rates of substitution have to be equal between agents. The second condition is efficiency in production, where the marginal rates of transformation needs to be equal. And the reasoning is the same. If this were not the case, then you can shift K from X to Y and L from Y to X in exchange, and both companies would make more of X and Y, right? You can simply set up the counterfactual. And then the third condition is efficiency in product mix, where the marginal utility ratio equals the marginal production cost ratio. And that is then flipped because costs are an opportunity cost, right? Rather than a benefit. And if this were not the case, then you can again work through the numbers and show that you can actually shift both K and L in the proportion, because we do also continue to honor production efficiency. You can shift capital and labor from the production of X to the production of Y, so as to make consumers better off, right? Both consumers better off. So these are the three conditions for Pareto optimality or efficiency. Now, it is important to note that the shorthand that some economists use when they drop the word Pareto in front of optimality is wrong. Because Pareto optimality is something very specific. As you know from the second welfare theorem, there are a great many. There's in fact an infinite continuum of efficient solutions, depending on the initial distribution. So in order to pick between these, we need to assume some sort of welfare function. We talked about it last week. And let's just posit one and call it W. Then in order for things to be optimal according to the social welfare function, we have an additional condition that we impose, and that is that the ratio of marginal utilities, Ux for A over Ux for B, has to be equal to the ratio of marginal contributions to welfare, W sub U for A has to be equal, the ratio of W sub U for A is to W sub U for B has to be equal to the ratio of marginal utilities. Now, calculus will immediately tell you that if you impose an additional constraint on a system that you already were able to solve, you cannot solve it any longer, right? Because now you have more conditions than you have degrees of freedom. So this is only feasible if you introduce an additional instrument apart from the exchange in the market, and that is typically a reallocation of income, right? This is the second Belfer theorem. This was for a bargaining economy. It all carries over to a market economy. The condition for consumption efficiency in a market economy is that the ratio of marginal utilities equals the price ratio for both consumers. And of course, if the market works well, then all consumers face the same prices and therefore the same relative prices. And again, this works best understood by just putting in an alternative, right? And let's assume that the utility ratio is 1 to 5 and the price ratio is 5 to 1. Then what consumer A can do is sell one X, gets 5 units of money in return, and can buy 5 Y for this, right? So you give up 1 X that costs you 1 util, and then you get 25 utils in return, because you can buy 5 Ys and each of them is worth 5. So that's a net gain of 24. So yes, this condition has to be met for the market to be efficient in consumption. Similarly, for production efficiency, the marginal product, how much you make of something, if you add, how much more you make of something if you add a little bit of labor or a little bit of capital, that ratio has to be equal to the input, to the ratio of input prices. And again, you can work through the numbers and say, yeah, if not, then I can easily expand production without increasing cost. A little bit more involved is product mix efficiency. But essentially, what you have there is that the output price ratio, that's Px over Py, does this now work? Yes, this now works. The output price ratio, Px over Py, should be equal to the input price ratio, Pk over P, for the two goods, and multiplied with a marginal productivity, right? And then you establish product mix efficiency as well. And the condition here is actually the one you see here, that the marginal revenue for making more X, that's P, the price of X, should equal the marginal cost of making X. And the marginal cost of making X is you put in a little bit more capital to make more of X, and that gives you a certain cost, normalized by how much you actually additional X you get by the marginal productivity of capital in making good X, right? And if this condition is met, that is, goods are sold at their marginal cost, then you also satisfy allocative or product mix efficiency. Now, this only works if the market is perfect. And that is a short word, 7 letters, but it actually means quite a lot. And these are not all the conditions that you need to satisfy, but these are the most important ones. The first one, and I'm going to talk about it at length, because it's so important for the environment, is that everything is tradable. that there's no trades possible, no exchanges possible outside the market. So everything is owned. Because if not, things can change hands outside the market, right? And if property rights are not well defined, then people can just take stuff and may disadvantage other people without them being able to do anything about it. All goods and services have to be private. Again, I'll come back to that at length. And it's essentially the same thing. There are no externalities. There's no consequences for third parties. Furthermore, all markets need to be perfectly competitive. Technically, long run average costs are non-decreasing. If not, you would not get that things are sold at the marginal cost of production. And of course, trade is costless. If you can't find things to your liking in Brighton, then you can just go to London and buy it, and this doesn't cost you anything in addition, right? That is essentially the assumption. And of course, for all this to work, for actually to find the Pareto optimum, everybody in the economy needs to know everything. Because that's the only way you can guarantee that you will exhaust all Pareto improving bargains, right? Now, this is just not true, right? From the perspective of the environment, it is not true because there's many things that matter, natural resources that are not bought and sold on markets. And that includes wilderness, that includes clean air, and so on and so forth, right? You cannot go to the supermarket and buy a pound of that. Many other resources are public goods. The climate is one. I'll define public goods in a couple of minutes, or open access. Ocean fisheries being a prime example there. Anybody can go and fish, provided that you have a boat, right? In many other instances, markets are imperfect. There's imperfect competition. That is true for the market for land, very important for the environment again, where the market is thin and some parties hold great market power as a result. The same is true for energy markets for minerals, where it's typically because these things are so capital intensive and there's very substantial economies of scale, means that certain parties have a lot of market power. Or, as in the case with energy, there may be natural monopolies, which is true for the road network, but also true for the electricity grid, and also true for the system of pipes that brings oil and gas, transports oil and gas around the world. And then there's externalities as well, right? So this whole notion that the market would lead to a Pareto optimum, even if a Pareto optimum is not an optimum, doesn't do much if you're interested in the environment, right? And we really need to look at other remedies and a different framework. So let's start with externalities. An externality is an unintended, uncompensated effect on a third party, and all these things matter. Unintended, we burn CO2, no, we burn coal to make electricity, not to make CO2. So it's unintended, right? We intentionally burn coal, but we do it to make electricity or to keep us warm, not to emit sulfur and CO2, right? So it's unintended. It's also uncompensated. If we burn coal, we emit sulfur dioxide. That sulfur dioxide gets into the atmosphere, gets transformed there, and causes acid rain that does all sorts of damage to plants and animals and buildings, and a little bit to human health as well. There's no economic transaction there. that acid rain just happens to us, right? It's not something that we go out actively and buy it. It's not that somebody sold it to us. No, it just happens, right? And there's no money changing hands. So it's uncompensated. And it happens to a third party, right? The people who burn the coal are not the same as the people who suffer the consequences. So those are the three key elements of an externality: unintended, uncompensated, and it affects people who are not part of the game, right? Outsiders to the economic activity or the economic transaction. Externality comes under different names. Some people call it an external effect. Some people call it an external cost. Some people call it an external diseconomy. That's all the same thing. Nowadays, I think most people call it just externality, but these other words you will meet as well. Now, this is of course an environment, so I speak about externalities as if they are negative. But there's also positive externalities. And actually, if you look at the older textbooks in economics, externalities used to be positive. And the earliest example of externalities is by Alfred Marshall in his Principles, where he talks about knowledge spillovers of one company to other companies. That's a positive externality. And if you look at the classic treatment of externalities in modern theory rather than in the stuff that we did in the 1870s by James Mead, he defines an externality in the context of bees pollinating the orchard. It is a positive externality, right? You hold bees to make honey, and the unintended implication of this is that you pollinate the trees next door. And again, no money is changing hands, so it's uncompensated, and the assumption is that the owner of the orchard is different than the owner of the bees, so that is a third party. So there may also be, there's also positive externalities. I just won't talk about them much. And of course, externalities can come from production, and I talked about making electricity, but of course they can also come from consumption. You may drive your car to work, and that emits CO2, right? That's a consumption decision, not a production decision. If we put a tax on the externality, and we put the right tax on the externality, the Pigou tax, then we say that the externality is internalized. It's still an externality, but now it's internalized and it's become innocent, right? Now, for those of you who are doing behavioral, George is also going to talk about internalities, but they are different than externalities because the word is different. Internalities are sort of externalities you impose on yourself, right? So the third party element drops. That's such things as addiction and those sort of things can be phrased as internalities, but that's something different, and I won't be talking about it. If you're interested, you can probably still switch to behavioral. So, now what do externalities do to the market? So the condition for production efficiency was that the marginal production of good X, but the same is true for good Y, the marginal production by using more labor versus using more capital, that ratio should be equal to the price ratio of the inputs, right? That is what we have. And the only difference between this condition and the one I showed previously is that I replaced the P with an S. That's the only difference, right? It's still the same thing, I just called it differently. But now that price is not a market price, but it is the total social cost. at the margin. So it's the social price rather than the market price. And then what you can say is that this social price S is the sum of the private input price P and the external price E. Right? And then this is the condition for production efficiency. But of course what the market would do, the market, because this is happening to third parties and it's uncompensated, the market doesn't see these externalities. So the market just does this thing here. And there's an additional P here that I don't think should be there. The market just sets things equal to the market price rather than the social price, right? So let's make this more concrete still. I'm going to simplify the model. Further, we're making two goods still, X and Y, but good X is made with capital and good Y is made with labor. And that's it. The profit of company X is, why did I do that? The company of profit X is their revenue, so the price that they get for selling the product times how much they have, how much they make of it, minus the capital that they use times the price of the capital, right? So that is the profit. Same for the production of goods. Y, the externality runs from the production of Y to the production of X. So the production function of the making of good X also depends on the amount of labor that is used by the other company. Now this is a highly stylized example. It's becoming less and less unrealistic. The way to think about this is that the workers of factory Y, the labor in factory Y, cause congestion if they get to work and stuff. That hinders the driverless cars of transport company X. Right? That is the way to think about this. It's a stylized example. Fortunately, you guys can now think. When I first talked about this example 10 years ago, everybody was looking at me, driverless cars. That's science fiction, right? It's no longer. Anyway, for company X, the first order condition for optimality is that the first partial derivative equals 0. So Px xk minus Pk is 0, and same is true for company Y. Py yl minus Pl is 0. And that then leads to these conditions here. Now let's look at this problem again, but now from the social perspective. Instead of maximizing individual profits, we're going to maximize total profit. So we're going to add up the profit of company X to the revenue of company X and revenue of company Y, and the cost of company X and the cost of company Y, and we're going to choose how much capital to allocate to this. So the pi k, dk must equal 0. This is the same condition as we had before, right? So k is not affected. But if we take the first partial derivative of the joint profit to labor, now we have these terms that we had before, but we now also have how the use of labor affects congestion, and how congestion affects the production of good X. And then, of course, that is valued at the sale price of good X. Right? This is the additional term that pops up. And then if we rewrite this, then that shows up here. We have to subtract a certain amount from the optimal output price. Let's look at the problem again. Now we're going to assume that a tax is imposed. And we're going to assume that the tax is imposed on company Y. We're going to add something to their cost. For every unit of labor that they use, they have to pay a price tau. Right? But this is individual optimization, so both companies just maximize their own profits. So the pi x dk is the same thing again, has to be equal to 0. The pi y dl, the same thing again, but now of course we also have the first partial derivative of tau L to L, so we have to subtract the tau here. This has to equal 0, and that means that the optimal output price, the tax pops up here, right? So we change the output price. Now if we compare that to the joint optimization, where we had this particular subtraction, what we now have is that if we set the tax tau equal to this thing here, then we're in the optimum, right? Does this make sense? We set the tax equal to how much congestion there is at the margin, times how much that congestion affects production, times the value of that production, right? So this is intuitive that tau should indeed equal this. This particular tax is known as the Pigou tax, right? It's that tax that you impose on a negative externality that restores the market to its Pareto optimum. This is named after Alfred Pigou. It's not entirely fair because the derivation I just gave you is due to Francis Bater, who wrote 38 years later. Pigou actually said this: if the amount of investment in any industry was carried exactly to the point at which the value of the marginal social net product there is equal to the central value of marginal social net product, national dividend, so far as that industry is concerned, would be maximized. Disregarding the possibility of multiple maximum positions, I propose for convenience to call the investment that would then be made in the industry the ideal investment, and the output that would be obtained the ideal output. Under conditions of simple competition, if in any industry the value of the marginal social net product of investment is greater than the value of the marginal private net product, this implies that the output obtained is less than the ideal output. If the value of the marginal social net product is less than the value of the marginal private net product, this implies that the output obtained is greater than the ideal output. Still with Pigou? It follows that on the conditions of simple competition, for every industry in which the value of the marginal social net product is greater than that of the marginal private net product, there will be certain rates of bounty or subsidies, the granting of which by the state would modify output in such a way as to make the value of the marginal social net products there more nearly equal to the value of the marginal social net products of resources in general. Thus, provided that the funds for the bounty can be raised by a mere transfer that does not inflict any indirect injury on production, increasing the size of the national dividend and the sum of the economic welfare, and there will be one rate of bounty, the granting of which would have the optimum effect in this respect. In like manner, for every industry in which the value of the marginal social net product is less than that of the marginal private net product, there will be certain rates of tax, the imposition of which by the state would increase the size of the national dividend and increase economic welfare, and one rate of tax which would have the optimum effect in this respect. Students sometimes complain that we do math. I think that Bater's derivation is a lot clearer than Pigou's original definition, right? These are a lot of words. I did it in a few symbols, right? Or Bater did it in a few symbols. But this is the Pigou tax. and there is uncertainty about the sign, as you can see. Actually, in different slides, tau is sometimes minus this and sometimes plus this. I'll double check. You probably know people who can't tell left from right. That's a certain disorder of the brain, right? That some people just don't know this. I am one of those people, but I have it in an extreme form. I can't tell left from right, but I also can't tell plus from minus, or exponentiation, taking the exponent from taking the natural logarithm, right? That's all the same to me. Division, multiplication, it's all the same. So always check my minus signs, because they may go wrong. In this case, I just opted. Well, sometimes I put in a minus and sometimes I don't. I'll double check which of the two it is. So that is the Pigou Tax. In environmental policy, people often talk about environmental taxes, where externalities are taxed. That is not necessarily Pigou tax, right? You can just put the wrong tax on. A tax that is not exactly equal to PX, XS, XMML. So then we're talking about an environmental tax rather than a Pigou tax. In policy circles, people also often talk about the polluter pays principle, which essentially means that, as a matter of principle, if somebody causes pollution, causes harm to others, then that person should pay for that. That's a legal principle and a moral principle. Of course, it's not the same as imposing the exact right tax. And oftentimes, people are made not to pay at the margin, but in total, and that sort of thing. Right? So keep those things apart. One further point about the Pigou tax. So an externality is unintended, uncompensated. James Buchanan, who you see here in the middle, took that to mean that the Pigou tax, the revenue of the Pigou tax, should go to the victims of the pollution, because then it would be compensated, right? That is not the case. What you need to do is internalize the externality. You need to make polluters pay at the margin for the damage that they do. That restores efficiency. You can, of course, use the tax revenue to compensate the victims, but typically what we see in most societies is actually that the government assumes the position of the victim and collects the money and then does with it whatever governments do with money, right? And we've just seen the Pandora Papers leak. That transfer, after the sort of the cost of the externality are internalized into the production decisions, the transfer then of the tax revenue to the victims of pollution would be a transfer in, not in the first welfare theorem sense of the word, but in the second welfare theorem of the word. That is an income redistribution. It is not needed for Pareto optimality. You may argue that it's a fair way of using these monies, but it's not Pareto optimal, right? It's also not Pareto optimal. It's Pareto is essentially blind to this. So that is a thing to keep in mind, right? That the compensation for the pollution that is paid for from the Pigou tax revenue is a lump sum transfer, and it's an element of equity, not an element of efficiency. Right? So let's move to the second main market imperfection, public goods. We need to talk about property rights. Lawyers typically distinguish three kinds of property rights: the right to use, the right to exclude, and the right to destroy. The right to use simply means that you can use it, but you cannot keep others away from this. The library would be an example. You have the right to use it, but you cannot tell other people to go away if they want to walk into the library as well. The right to exclude actually means that you can keep people out, right? Unlike the library, in your apartment, you can tell people to leave, right? Because it's yours in that sense. But of course, if you're renting, then you do not have the right to wreck your apartment, right? You can ask people to leave, you have the right to exclude, and of course the right to use if you pay your rent, but you do not have the right to destroy it. Unlike if you own a property, then if you wish, you can destroy it, right? So property rights come in gradations, and of course property rights are often subject to all sorts of constraints, right? I own a car, I have the right to use that car, therefore I have the right to throw you out of my car if I don't want you in there anymore, and I have the right to destroy my car, but not in such a way that it would harm others, right? I cannot use my car and destroy it by driving into somebody else's house, right? That is obviously something I cannot do. So that is how lawyers would look at property rights. Economists have a different way of looking at this, and that is through the lenses of rivalry and excludability. So a private good is both rivalrous and excludable. And the example I put up here is ice cream. And rivalry means, in my mind, is a physical concept. If I eat my ice cream, you cannot eat it because it's no longer there, right? So there's rivalry in consumption. If you take it, then I can't. Excludability is more of a legal or a moral concept. If I have an ice cream, you may not eat it because it's my ice cream and it would be theft, right? And we have objections to stealing things from others. So that is the difference between rivalry and excludability. And private goods are both rival and excludable. There's also goods that are rival but not excludable. And the standard example there is the commons good, named after the commons that you would find in many traditional societies, including England. It used to be that every village had a commons, a field typically in the middle of the village in England, where every villager could graze their sheep. Right? The property was owned by everybody, by the collective of the village, and everybody could put their sheep on there. And that means that it's non-excludable. Provided that you live in the village, you automatically had the right to graze your sheep there. So it's non-excludable. It is, of course, excludable to people from other villages, right? But not to the people in the village. But it is rival consumption, because if my sheep eat the grass, your sheep cannot eat the grass. right? So it's rivalrous consumption, but non-excludable consumption. And the immediate problem there is, well, if I put my sheep on there and they eat all the grass, then the pain of overgrazing does not fall on me. The pain of land degradation doesn't just fall on me, but it's shared with everybody in the village. So the benefits are private. I get the wool, I get the milk, I get the meat of the sheep, but the costs of overgrazing are not private. I get only a fraction of those. So it is in my interest to put as many sheep as I have on the commons. And the same is of course true for my neighbors, right? So the problem with commons goods is overgrazing, overuse, overconsumption. There's also goods that are excludable but non-rival. And they are, I think, best called club goods. I forget, I put a photo of a band up that a couple of years ago was popular, but I forget who they were. And the photo is too small to see. If you go to a gig, obviously that is excludable, right? Because you need to buy a ticket to get in. But once you're in, you can enjoy the music, right? And your enjoyment of the music does not affect other people's enjoyment of the music. You may actually get some benefit from seeing other people enjoying it, but let's assume that you're a pretty selfish sort of person and you don't see that particular benefit, then it is non-rival in consumption, right? But excludable, right? The problem with club goods is one of fixed cost, essentially. Once the club owner has sort of put up the building and hired the band and everything, incurred a large fixed cost, letting an additional person in the door does not impose a cost on the club owner, right? But does bring benefit, right? So the variable cost of provision is actually very small, but the variable revenue is high. So the club owner would have an incentive to let more people in than would be pleasant or safe. So there would be overconsumption. Now there is an issue here, and that is that the problem with club goods is congestion. But the problem with common goods can also be congestion. Because if you take a road, you cannot be denied access to the road, provided that you come in the right vehicle. But you do take up road space if you're there, right? So the consumption of the commons goods, that is the road network, actually can lead to congestion. So confusingly, in some of the literature, you would find some people call club goods congestible goods and other people would call commons goods congestible goods. Congestion is a problem with both club goods and commons goods, and just avoid the word congestible, right? And then there are pure public goods that are neither excludable nor rivalrous. And the lighthouse is the traditional example. The Great Wild, I think this is the North Pole, is another example. The climate is an example, right? Me enjoying the weather does not affect you enjoying the weather, or me hating the weather does not affect you hating the weather, right? And nor if I change the climate by emitting CO2, is there anything you can do about it? You just have to suck it up, right? So the climate is both non-excludable and non-rival, right? I've said all this, right? The problem with public goods is under provision. The provider gets only a fraction of the benefits of her investment, and this is because of the lack of excludability, right? the rest going to others, and therefore invest less. And a social planner would count the total benefit and thus invest more. And besides under provision, there's also overconsumption. The consumer feels only a fraction of the losses imposed by her decisions, the rest being felt by others, and therefore consumes more than she should. And a social planner would again count the total cost. Now we can make this a little bit more precise, and Samuelson did this. This is the old Samuelson. He did this when he was much younger than he looks in this picture. The Pareto, the condition for Pareto optimality for a private good is that the marginal rate of substitution equals the marginal rate of transformation, right? We looked at that before. For a public good, this is not the case. For a public good, the condition for optimality is that the marginal rate of transformation, how you make stuff, equals the sum of the individual marginal rates of substitution. Or to put it differently, with private goods you do vertical aggregation, and with public goods you do horizontal aggregation. So let's look at the construction of a demand curve for a private good. And this is the example that you see in the Kolstad textbook. Kolstad has lived in California for most of his life, and people have very strange names there. So we have a girl called Anna, that's common, and then this guy called Brewster. Like, why would you call your son Brewster? Anyway, that is his name. And both have a demand curve, right, which essentially tells you that if the price is this, then it's the marginal willingness to pay. Okay, yeah. If Anna has very little of good Q, she would be willing to pay a lot to get her hands on the first unit, and the more she already has, the less she's willing to pay to get more, right? This is demand curve, the same is true for Brewster. And then the aggregate demand curve, essentially, well, if there's very little, then Brewster's bid holds and Anna gets nothing. And that goes until the price hits slightly below 2.5, and at that point Brewster's demand is satisfied to the extent that he is no longer able to outbid Anna's demand, right? And Anna's demand takes over, and she starts consuming, and because her demand curve is shallower than Brewster's demand curve, she continues to dominate. And this is the aggregate demand curve. And that is essentially this curve plus this curve if you look at it that way, right? So it's horizontal aggregation, right? This is Brewster's demand curve, and then this is Anna's demand curve shifted to the right. That's true for a good that is non-rival. For a good that is, no, that is true for a good that is rival. For a good that is non-rival, for a public good, you aggregate the demand curve differently. Because if supply is very low, then Anna is willing to pay 2.5, and Brewster is willing to pay 5, almost 5. But they both can have it, right? Because you can, it's non-rival in consumption, so both Anna and Brewster can have it. So total demand at this point is not Brewster's, but it's Brewster's plus Anna. 7.5. Right? Their willingness to pay, the total willingness to pay is 7.5. And the same is true everywhere. And demand goes to zero at 25 already, rather than much higher than 25 in the private goods. And essentially what you do here is you're still adding those demand curves, but now you add them vertically. Right? You're adding not on this x, but you're adding on this axis. Clear? And you see both demand curves drawn here. This is the demand curve. The dotted line is demand for a rival good. This is the demand for a non-rival good. And those demand curves simply look differently. If the supply curve is the same, that's drawn here, you immediately see that they cross at different points, right? That the optimal, well, they cross at different points, but there's no meaning to that. That will come in 2 slides. That clear to everybody? Vertical versus horizontal aggregation. This is known as the Samuelson condition. If you have a market that meets this particular condition, it's known, that market is said to be in a Lindahl equilibrium. Named after Eric Lindahl, who you see here. And essentially what you have in a Lindahl equilibrium satisfies the Samuelson condition. And essentially what you have is that the price in the market is the sum of the individual willingnesses to pay, the individual valuation of the public good. Now that is very nice as a theoretical construct, but it's completely impractical, right? So essentially, if we're talking about the provision of a public good, let's take Stanmer Park next door, right, which is a public good, and you all can go, if the weather permits, go and play football or lie in the sun or do whatever you want to do there. You all have your individual willingness to pay. You all appreciate this, presumably. The optimal provision essentially means that the city of Brighton and Hove will need to solicit your private price for this, and then add it all up, and then say, well, this is the total provision that we should give, which is completely impractical, right? It's completely impractical to measure everybody's individual willingness to pay. In the market, sort of prices emerge and reflect your willingness to pay, but there is no market here. We need to solicit this from people, and actually after the break, we're gonna, in weeks 7, 8, and 9, we're gonna talk extensively about how to do this. It's hard. You can take that now already, right? Final chapter. I started way too fast, right? Because I was in a panic in the beginning. So, how does the market provide public goods? There's one error on the slides that you have that I did correct this morning. There's another one that will come later today. So how would the market provide public goods? Let's assume that we derive utility U from the private consumption, the bundle of private goods, X, and a public good G. Right? That enters into our utility function. That doesn't help much. What you can say, of course, is that we're going to look at the private provision of the public good. and we're going to take away part of our income. W is our income, right? And we're going to privately provide the public good to an amount small g. That means that part of our income is gone, and that means that our private consumption X falls, right? So that is there. And then, of course, the provision of the public good is now G plus G bar, where G bar is the stuff that other people provide, right? So far, this is just a notation. And now I'm going to assume that everybody is the same. It's always a good assumption. So this G bar is really the private contributions of everybody else. There's n people in this society, so that's n minus 1 times G, right? Now, in order to get some insight, I'm going to draw an indifference curve in this G bar G space. So on this axis, we're looking at your private contribution to the public good. And on this axis, we're looking at the sum total of the other people's contribution, G bar. And now I'm going to draw an indifference curve. And that is U-shaped. It's called U0. And it essentially means it's an indifference curve, so utility is the same everywhere. So let's suppose this is the provision by others of the public goods, and you provide nothing. You may conclude that there's too little of this public good, so you're gonna chip in some, of course then reducing your private consumption, right? And this, you're indifferent here, right? So you think there's too little, so you're willing to contribute a little bit. Note the slope here, right? It actually goes down like this. At this point, you're actually paying quite a bit of your income towards providing the public good, and you have very little left for private consumption. So in order for you to be indifferent to that, it has to be the case that the others chip in a lot for the public good, right? So this curve at this point has to go up. And actually at this point you're mostly consuming the public good, but there is a whole lot of public good, so you don't really mind that there's very little private consumption. So if the curve slopes down here like this and it slopes up here like this, there has to be a turning point somewhere, right? So this indifference curve has to be U-shaped. Right? Everybody still with me? Now let's introduce alternative indifferent curves. If the others provide more of the public good, you're moving in this direction, then your utility goes up, right? So U1 is greater than U0, and U2 is greater than U1, and so on and so forth, right? So these are alternative indifference curves. And at this point, the others provide so much of the public good that you actually don't care anymore about having more of it, so you just use all your income and spend it on yourself, right? So there's no longer the U shape, there's no longer a minimum. So this is what the decision problem looks like. Now these are indifference curves, and indifference curves go flat at the same point as utility curves go flat. So your best response to what the others are providing is this curve here, right? Because that crosses where the indifference curve is flat, and if the indifference curve is flat, the utility curve is flat, so this is your optimal response. So if the others provide this amount, you're going to respond by providing this amount. If the others provide this amount, you're going to respond by providing this amount, right? Now, the supply curve is this thing here, right? This is what the rest is doing, because everybody is identical, so they all respond to each other in the same way. So that looks like this. And then the market equilibrium is this point here, where the supply curve meets the best response curve. And the optimal point is this thing here, where the supply curve equals the slope of the indifference curve, where supply equals marginal demand, marginal utility, sorry, demand. And you see immediately what this does, right? It's a bit of a charts example, that your G star, the optimal provision of the public good, is much larger than the market provision of the public good. Right? I should have put this up. That's where supply equals marginal utility, and this is where supply equals the best response. So this is a graphical explanation of why you would under-provide the public good in a private market, right? I don't know why that thing is there. Said all this, problem with public goods is under-provision and overconsumption. This is not just theory. This is a paper that came out around this time last year. What we're looking at is Argentina. And we're looking at fishing off the coast of Argentina. Now, countries have exclusive economic zones, and exclusive economic zones are typically 200 nautical miles wide, and they essentially say, well, everything that is in this exclusive economic zone is yours. So the fish within the exclusive economic zone is Argentinian fish. The fish themselves may think of that differently, but legally, from a human perspective, those fish belong to Argentina. The fish that swims outside of the exclusive economic zone, in the high seas, in the open ocean, belongs to anybody. There is no property rights assigned. Now, fishing boats nowadays have to have transponders that tell us exactly where they are at all time. And also they have to record what they're doing. Not every fishing boat does this, but most of them roughly comply to this. And from this you can construct fishing hours. And you see that pretty clearly here. The lighter the color, the more intense the fishing. And you see indeed that just outside of the exclusive economic zone, there is a lot more intensive fishing than you see inside the exclusive economic zone. Of course, the fish don't know where that zone is, right? And the sea looks exactly the same on both sides of the demarcation line. So this is a pure legal thing. If you find this one difficult to read, then look at this picture here. This is fishing activity in the exclusive economic zone, and this is fishing activity outside the exclusive economic zone. The sea is exactly the same on both sides of the line, right? But you see that fishing activity is very, very different and much, much higher. There is no control of property rights, there are no property rights, so there's overfishing outside the exclusive economic zone in the common pool that is the high seas. Now, if you don't believe these transponders, if you think that they regularly mess with these things, and they don't honestly report the hours that they're fishing, there's another thing that you can do, and that is to go at night and look at the lights. Because one thing that fishing boats don't do is turn off their lights at night, because that is pretty dangerous, right? They may sort of turn off their transponder, but they won't turn off their lights. So this is the same story here. Pictures taken at night. The lighter the picture, the more lights there are. The only lights there are fishing boats. And again here, same area, you see it's pretty dark. Inside the exclusive economic zone, you see it's much lighter immediately outside the exclusive economic zone. And if you find it difficult looking at spatial information, here we see the whole thing aggregated, and you see the same effect here, right? So this is not just theory, right? If you have a commons, and the high seas is a commons, the result is overconsumption. And in this case, overconsumption is overfishing, and you see it jumps more than threefold, right? So what can we do against this? I have 7 minutes left. Public goods. We actually talked about this in the seminar last week. Really have no alternative here but to provide it from tax revenue. Raise income taxes, raise sales taxes, something like that, and provide the public good from the public purse. That is the only option that you have. For commons goods, you have alternatives. One way to deal with problems of overfishing is to impose a quota, a total quota. This is the amount of fish you can get out, and then assign that to individual fishing companies and let them trade. If you misallocated them initially, let them sort it out amongst themselves, right? This is one way of doing it that has proven pretty successful. First in New Zealand, now in the North Sea, very similar system, and actually in seas around the world. This only works if there's actually an authority to do this, right? This only works if there is a government in Argentina that does this, but on the high seas this cannot be done, right? Because there's no authority to impose such limits. For another problem with commons goods, such as congestion on roads, the solution there is variable pricing. That you pay a tax that varies by time of day and that varies by your location. Now this has been known in economics for decades, that this is the optimal solution, but of course until recently it was completely impractical to do this. But nowadays, well, at least your navigation system and your phone know exactly where you are and when you're there, right? So nowadays it is actually perfectly feasible to charge people on the exact use of the roads, by time of day, by location, within a few meters. Of course, politics is way behind this. We are still, the road system in the UK and in most other countries is financed through partly general taxation and partly through road taxes. But those road taxes are just, you pay a certain amount depending on the weight of your car per year, right? Regardless of whether you park your car on your driveway all year long or whether you drive it a lot, constantly, you pay the same, right? The reason that this is differentiated by weight is that heavier vehicles do more damage to the roads. That is sort of the only concession that is made to the actual cost in providing the roads. But this can be, with modern technology, can be much more precise and should be much more precise, right? Sort of the solutions that they have, that they give you information, this road is congested and you should know the road is a traffic jam 10 kilometers ahead, so you should slow down now. That hardly works, right? With club goods, the problem there is also congestion, because the variable cost of allowing more people into the club is practically zero. So you could sort of say, well, the government should step in and tax that at the margin, but that would be different for every club, right? So yes, that is the theoretical solution, but it's not very practical. It's unclear whether it's legal to charge one venue in Brighton different rates than another venue in Brighton, because as soon as you start doing that, you need to have a pretty hard legal criterion why they are different, right? So that would be the optimal solution, but it's just not very practical. The practical solution that people have gone for there is impose health and safety standards. That in this club you can allow 70 people in and not more. In another club you can allow 3,000 people in but not more, right? That is the way to prevent overconsumption of club goods. So, to sum up, externalities are unintended, uncompensated side effects. The result is a suboptimal allocation, and the solution there is to impose a Pigou Tax. For public goods, the issue is that the market works fine if it's a good market, if it's a perfect market for private goods. But for public goods, there's overconsumption and under-provision, and the solution there is that the government starts providing it, that you regulate access, and that you impose charges for use. That was it for today.